questions. What I did is I handed out to you, here's the assignment. Nick is going to read the assignment that he did not read it or obtain in email. So Nick, tell me the first statement there, number one.
Explain in your own words the Federalist Principle conveyed in Federalist 51.
Okay, in your own words, that means you actually had to read, you didn't get the assignment to read Federalist 51. I think it was quoted in your assignment, a portion of Federalist 51 was in your textbook. I read 2 Supreme Court cases today, and the Federalist 51 was quoted in it, and they were on the balance of power, separation of powers, Federalist issue, okay? So, Federalist 51. Now, I did this in your own words, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you what people said was the federal principle. Before I do that, for those who didn't even read the Federalist 51, but read their textbook, Matthew, without reading Jason's, what do you think the federal principle is?
I'm afraid to answer.
Afraid?
Yes.
But you didn't read Federalist 51.
I didn't have to.
Well, that's good. Actually, it's good to,
Cannot count it.
I like the bent toward, can't guess? Okay, Nick, you think you can guess?
I read it for history, but that was a while ago, and I
Ah.
don't remember the principle.
Okay, did you read the textbook? What were they implying? What was the whole subject of the textbook? Do you remember? I'm recording this.
You wanna have like a little meeting, go over it?
Yeah, you can do that.
Can we bring the textbook?
No. We'll do this. Here we go. I'm going to read somebody's response. The Federalist Principle, it's actually federal principle, is the idea that politicians should have both the power and ambition to control the government and prevent it from growing tyrannical. That politicians should have, does anybody agree with that? Or disagree? Okay. We're going to look at this. We're actually going to read it together and look at that. Here's another one. To provide each branch of the government the means necessary to accomplish their job, federal principle, each branch, that several constituent parts may be the means of keeping each other in their proper places, separate, distinct exercise of different powers of government. This is kind of a quote. I actually tried to find where that was in specifically, but I couldn't find it. It may have been there, I just missed it. And then let's go to another person. The Federalist Principle, it's a federal principle, uses the ambition of separate parts of government to control and restrict each other, with the ultimate control being vested in the people. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. And I'm going to save one for last. It's Sarah, so I'm actually naming her because it's awesome. All right. Jason. I'm not going to read his. So I've mentioned his name. Here's another person. To keep the branches of government in check. Federal principles keep the branches of government in check. It doesn't go into how, but that's essentially getting the idea there. Somebody else said, I like this. The federal principle conveyed in Federalist 51 is that, so here's their opinion, the government is separated so that justice does not occur. I'm not trying to get it right. Fortunately, you're paying attention. The government is separated so justice does not occur. Well, again, it's in your own words. It very well may be that separation of government powers makes it so justice doesn't occur. I think it's a type error. I think it does occur. Here's another person saying that government wants people to say what they do and tell the government essentially what to do. And that's why there's so many branches so they can get a widespread opinion. They don't have the ultimate say, but they do have an influence. So we're actually going to go through 51 and look at these things. Here's another comment. Different branches should have nothing to do with the others. So there's a couple of little chihuahuas biting at the heels of the Federalist Principle. Now I'm going to be mean to Sarah by reading hers because it's good. It's really good. Federal principle conveyed in the paper is the idea of checks and balances. Checks and balances. Good. Each of the separate branches and parties keep each other in check. So here's separate branches and why. The power is divided among the different groups, and each group exercises only powers it's given. So she identified those, it's separate and limited. I mean, it's literally constrained. And then, so those are the comments that people had about what the federal principle is. So now, is there any questions so far on it? Please, somebody ask me a question. Anything? Okay, you had your chance. Goodness, Christian, are you
Had a
sleepy?
comment.
What's that?
Had a comment.
Okay, what's your comment?
Just, you said Federalist Principle when you
Federal.
were talking. You did say Federalist Principle though, as
Yes.
you were talking.
Isn't it easy to do?
Yeah, it is.
So, thank you for commenting. I like that. I feel better now that somebody's commenting. All right,
Yeah.
okay, what I'm gonna do is, I just handed to you Federalist 51. Federalist 51. There's a little question whether it was James Madison or Alexander Hamilton who wrote this. There's a couple of things in here that make me think it was James Madison, by his style, and because this is one of his favorite topics. He visited this topic more than the other guys, more than Alexander Hamilton or John Jay, but it could have been a corroboration too. So, or a collaboration, I guess is the better word. So let's look at this. Does everybody have it? Okay, Matthew, you got it? Okay, page 1, session 11. What I'm gonna do is we're gonna look at these things that I've underlined or made bold or something like that because they're the essence of federalism. The textbook really was complaining, oh, the evil Congress is doing the following things. Well, it turns out there's a lot of things they said in the textbook that just ticked me off. The federal government's forcing you to do that. No, they're not. Yes?
This could possibly be written by Hamilton because the first sentence could be said yelling.
To what? Okay. Very well. To what expedient then? Give me liberty or give me death. Wrong guy. That was Patrick. Okay, to what expedient then shall we finally resort? For maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments. So that's it, partition, separating power among the several departments. Let's go to the next underlined statement. That the structure of government, its several constituents parts, may by their be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. That the constituent parts be the means by which you keep the other person in place. I'll give an example of that today. Speaking of guns, this is for you, Parker. The Brady Bill. The Brady Bill. This guy got hit from the attempt on President Reagan. There was some bullet or something, I don't know if it's a deflected bullet or a bullet itself in the head of Mr. Brady. I can't remember his office or whatever his position was at the time. But in honor of him, they started doing this thing where they would do criminal background checks on people before they bought guns. And it was a federal law. And it directed chief law enforcement officers of wherever that place was in the land of America, that the local dealer, before and they used the term transfer, they didn't sell, they said transfer weapon, that before they do it, they have to do a criminal background check on somebody, or at least provide the information to them. They fill out a form and they give it to the chief law enforcement officer. It could be the sheriff of the town, depending on the government localities, the way they set up, whoever it was, the chief law enforcement officer. And it started being implemented. But then there was a couple of chief law enforcement officers in the country who had gone, when they took the job, they gave an oath to support and defend the Constitution, okay? They weren't experts. One of these guys actually interviewed on the radio that sued the United States over this. And comments that he told to me, I've heard him say in other interviews, he didn't really know this stuff. He really didn't understand these things, except that when he took the oath, and his family had been in politics, he'd been a police officer, so it was just, he became a sheriff of a town in Arizona, I think. And he might have been New Mexico, something like that. He's in the West, of course, the sheriff in the West. And so when he took the oath, he started really looking into his job. And his limits, what are my authority limits? As Christian man, so he looks by what authority am I doing this? And what authority do I have compared to the next guy? And as he started doing that, he realized, wait a minute. It's not the Congress of New Mexico. This is the Congress of the United States. They have limited powers. And I'm a sheriff here, and I have limited powers. And there's certain people I'm accountable to, and right now in my job, it's God. The laws of the state and God. I mean, it really is. So he said, I can't you're asking me to do something as if I worked for Congress. And he says, you know what, I can't do it. Because I've given an oath to God, I cannot. It's like a duty of religion now. I can't do what you just asked me to do, Congress. And so he brought a case up in court. That is an example of the separate parts of federalism. It's not just the president and the judiciary and then the legislature, and it's not just, Congress, it's separate branches, and it's not just the House of Representatives versus the Senate with different ambitions, checking each other. The federal principle for this nation goes to the fact that now there's a boundary between Congress and Virginia and North Carolina. In fact, they can't make a treaty among themselves, or they can, and the Constitution says they can make a compact, but even if they make a compact together from state to state, they have to get Congress approval. So there's all these the federal principle is that all these separate things will have a separate job, and that each one of them, if they're accountable to their job, will be the person and the power that would deliberately, because of their position, stand against the other when the other power tries to intrude on something that is in their area of concern. So that's what the federal principle is. That's why I said put it in your own words, because it's kind of a concept, okay? Let's look at this next thing underlined there. Down to the third paragraph, there's a big paragraph down the bottom of the page. In order to lay the foundation for that separate, distinct exercise of the different powers of government, going on to the next underlined spot, each department should have a will of its own. Each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others. Originally, the Senate was chosen by the legislatures of the states. So that gave, and there's some comments in the Federalist Papers that talk about how important that was, because it gave the legislatures a chance really to find people that really knew what they were doing for their very important, very particular job of the U.S. Senate. Now that gave a legislature of a state the ability to put somebody in the Congress. Now the people they're now electing the House of Representatives differently. The different interest that would put them in their House of Congress that would be different than the interest of the Senate originally. Let's go to the next page. Flip the next page. We're on page 2. There we go again. The first paragraph that is begun there on page 2. Each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others. And that was what I did here. When you said the second part of the assignment was for you to determine which statement you thought best was a strong statement that really explained how the federal principle would work. What would be its best tool? What principle in the federal principle out of this thing listed here would be the best tool to keep from happening all those horrible things they said in the textbook? So look at the next paragraph, the beginning. I'm going to have somebody else read. Okay, Matthew. See where it says, but the great security? Go ahead and read that.
But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others.
In layman's terms, they make sure that when you're given an office, that there's some value to it, a particular value, a particular motive. The House of Representatives, they're the ones that are going to figure out spending and taxing. okay? If the people are gonna have to pay for something, the people ought, and their representatives ought to be the one to come up with the idea. And then, of course, we have no excuse when it comes to pay for the thing, okay? So, and if we don't like it, 2 years later, we fire that person, put somebody else in. So it gives a motivation to exercise the next thing. Now notice this thing in bold. Well, by the way, Sarah said that she liked as a strong statement that paragraph, the one that I first cited in page 2. Isaac cited this one as a very strong statement. Sarah also mentioned that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So when you think about the federal principle, it sums it up pretty well with that ambition competing against ambition. Now, I'm going to go to Nick, you got yours?
What?
You got this handout that I've just given you? We're on page 2? Yeah, I'm trying to stay awake here. So, where it says ambition must be made to counteract ambition, and it says man must be connected with constitutional rights of the place, that's the office. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. Now, read from there.
But what is government itself, but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control of the government. But experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions.
I'm about to sneeze. Thank you. The pause that refreshes. What we're gonna do, okay, so the point is, you've heard that thing, if angels, what's it say here? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Somebody had written 80 years, 90 years earlier said, because men are vicious, corrupt, and degenerate, we have need of government, courts, and things like that. So this is not a new statement that people are quoting Madison, but that was something that had actually been regurgitated by many people in our nation about, really, they're citing the idea that men are fallen. So this idea of having, in that last statement, that dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control in government, but the problem is, you don't want to have just a crazy revolution every time people don't like the way the government is. So these auxiliary precautions were very deliberately well-educated people building the frame of government, figuring out what the best way was to meet the different ends that each department should have to meet. Okay. Okay, go down to the bottom paragraph there. It says, but it's not possible to give each department an equal power of self-defense. This is a very important principle also in our nation and in the states, is this next statement. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. So that means is the courts, the executive departments, that they are, if they know their job, are supposed to give deference, or if they've got a question, a little bit of a doubt on something, lean with what the legislature said. If you're in a courtroom, you say, well, I don't like that law. Well, you know what, the courtroom, they should be doing what the legislature says, unless you really, 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 really have a significant thing that you can back up really, really, really well, that courts and the executive agency should always implement what the legislature says. And this is an example or evidence of that in American law. It's a statement, because the Supreme Court comes back and reads the things that are said here. But I will tell you, the things that we read in Sir William Blackstone, whether I've handed it to you or not, he had already said the same thing, that there's a stronger power, the strongest power is indeed the legislature. Okay, does anybody have any question about that? I probably won't get any, but anybody have any question about that? Okay, well, stop me. Okay, the remedy for this is divide the legislature into two different branches, render them by different modes of election, different principles of action. See, it used to be different modes of election. As little connected with each other as the nature of the common functions and their common dependence on society will admit. Go to the next page, page 3. Okay. The compound. Oh, I want you to go to, like, it starts out, page 3, starts out, it's finishing a paragraph. And then there's a paragraph that starts, and then there's a paragraph that's real skinny, says there are moreover, et cetera, et cetera. In the next paragraph, it says first, in a single republic, blah, 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 blah. One of the things that, some comments I said, or saw about when I said, please explain in your own words, these ideas of the people keeping the government in check. Ultimately, the people are responsible, but our government is set up so that you're not really, for the most part, 99.99% of the time, except for election time, you're not really relying on the people. You will ultimately do that because there's procedures in government, say if they're gonna come out with a regulation, Congress has set up rules so that before the executive department comes out with a regulation, they publish it in the Federal Register and let everybody know what they're about to do. And that gives you an opportunity to ask questions or make comments for a certain period of time, which they promptly ignore and press on smartly anyway. Okay, so, but nevertheless, you have an opportunity to give input. But look what this says here. In that paragraph, starts with the words first. I'm gonna skip a lot of things. I'm gonna go down to where it's underlined. In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people. So in this government that's been set up, it's presumed that you have, or the people, have surrendered power, actually abdicated it effectively, given it over, surrendered it. Have surrendered it is first divided between two distinct governments, then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. So it's a very, I think, and the thing is, the bad part is in America, I see the American people have not just surrendered these powers to the government, they've surrendered their attention to it. And if we do that and leave it to the people who are in government to very conscientiously look into these things, make sure that the other portions of government are not intruding on their job. Okay, if they're not conscientiously doing that, then we're gonna have some trouble. And if we're not paying attention, and if the news is giving us in-flight entertainment while our plane's in a nosedive, we don't even know what the government's doing, we're not paying attention. There's some great dangers. Now, I'm gonna do a little review while you're all in a stupor. Why are governments instituted, question mark? Yeah, okay, you said, before his hand went up, what were you gonna say,
I
Isaac?
was just gonna say to control evil men.
To control
keep
evil
them in
men?
check, I guess.
Okay, it's to punish, I'm gonna go to Matthew, then Hunter, and then Christian. Okay, to punish the evildoers, that's in the Bible.
There aren't governments servants of God?
Okay, they're servants of God to punish evildoers and praise to do good. Hunter?
I was gonna say, government is instituted among men to do the will of God and to punish evil and basically what they just said, so thanks guys.
Okay, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say the government's part of its main purpose. It kinda goes along with what Isaac said, but it's not to control all the evil deeds of man, but rather to restrict their worst deeds and to punish them
For what purpose?
for the overall safety of the majority.
Okay, I'm going into the Declaration of Independence here. What is a classic line? This is gonna be on your test.
Give me.
Fill in a blank.
Oh.
Government
life,
is
liberty,
instituted
and
to
And proper sex.
protect what?
People.
Life, liberty, and property.
Life, liberty, and property. See how quickly we forget it?
Yes.
Everybody in these separate branches are supposed to be under the understanding that government is instituted to protect life, liberty, and property. And if they're not conscientiously understanding that is the ultimate purpose, that's their ultimate ministry, they're going to be a minister of God for our good. They're going to be. God will do that. God will glorify himself in that way. But if they don't know what particular function, like the secretary of the church does some typing, she doesn't preach, she doesn't teach necessarily. Okay? She's got a particular function. It ultimately glorifies God and fulfills a ministry purpose. If those who are exercising the power forget that they're there to protect life, liberty, and property, and they've got a particular function, a particular portion, and they called it that they are partitioned. They've been partitioned a certain task that ultimately supports that end. If they forget that, and you're not paying attention, that's when we have some dangerous innovations that will ultimately affect you and your children. So it's not just about glorifying the fact that we have a federal system that has a separation of powers. Big deal, so it's less likely they get together and be stupid. They'll be stupid separately. And you know what I mean? But if they forget their purpose, that they're there, their particular ministry, to glorify God, the way they're going to do it is that they're protecting life, liberty, and property. Okay? So, men are fallen. Okay, and I'm going to probably wrap it up here on this Federalist Principle, but I'm going to read to you something from Justice O'Connor here. Years ago, when I started studying how do you obey God and man at the same time, sometimes the things that God says are different than the things that men ask you to do. How do I obey God? How do I obey men? And that's when I began to study and realize that there's authority structures and that God has set up its authority. We all submit to the authority that God has instituted. If government will submit to that authority, then they're going to protect our life, our liberty, and our property. They're going to do extremely well. God will be sensationally glorified. And it makes it easier for us to do the same thing, to submit to the little administrative laws they come up with, as well as the no-brainers that are just right and wrong. It makes it easier when everybody is really submitting themselves to the Lord. And I started studying those boundaries, and I began to find out that there were certain powers that government didn't have. I just thought if Congress did it, it's like a higher law. Okay? I thought that states had a smaller, weaker law, and Congress had a bigger, stronger law. I didn't know that Congress doesn't have authority, that they're limited in their powers, they're limited in their authority, and states are protected in their powers and authority, so God would be glorified. I didn't understand that. Now here's a case, New York versus the United States. Now you would think regulating the, what do they call it, nuclear power waste from nuclear power plants. It's got to go across state lines, it's got to go across state borders. This is a national issue. If you've got a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, they may not have the place to store this stuff while it's rotting for the next 40 billion years. They may not have that in Pennsylvania without having it pollute the water and the local deer population or whatever it is they've got to do. So it is a national concern. It's an important, and it's a commercial concern. The things of Congress, that involves Congress. Well, it turns out that Congress had this plan to have the states take care of radioactive waste. And they said, okay, Pennsylvania, we see your issue. By the way, Maryland is benefiting from your electricity, and so is Virginia, so is New York. There's all these other states that are benefiting from your power plant. This is an intrastate or interstate issue. So I'm going to direct that this state, you're going to do the following thing to make sure that these wastes are taken care of. Now, we'll pay for it. we'll cover it. This is not an unfunded mandate, but we're gonna cover this thing. And New York says, wait a minute. Whether you pay for it or not, who says that you can tell New York what to do? Congress? Oh, how rebellious. No. Checks and balances, having the will and the strength and the know-how to say, wait a minute, for everybody's protection for the long run, Congress, you're limited, and this is what happened. It says, this is Justice O'Connor's, New York versus United States. These cases implicate one of our nation's newest problems of public policy, perhaps oldest question of constitutional law. So it's a new thing that we have to deal with. Can the Constitution handle nuclear power waste? It says the public policy issue involves the disposal of radioactive waste. And then they cited a whole bunch of regulations and things like that. This is what they said. We conclude, while Congress has substantial power under the Constitution to encourage the states to provide for the disposal of radioactive waste generated within their borders, the Constitution does not confer upon Congress the ability simply to compel the states to do so. Has anybody heard of the term, and this is what was said in your textbook, it said these unfunded mandates. Hello, I'm gonna tell you folks, this textbook was nice, it was good, I like some of the things they said, but right there, because it's elementary, it's loopy-doopy. I just made up a word, loopy-doopy, okay? It says these unfunded mandates, there are no such things as an unfunded mandate. It's, when you hear the term, you're gonna hear it over and over and over again. You're gonna be listening to a politician who is not as educated as you on this. Did you see what U.S. Supreme Court said? They're not giving us news, they're just telling us what, if you study the Constitution, the frame of government, you would say that's the truth. Oh, I'm glad they finally acknowledged it. And they did, that they have no authority to compel the states to do anything. They can't do it. And if you go to Prince and Mack versus United States, actually, I'm gonna do it right here. I'm actually gonna quote the Supreme Court. As an initial matter, Congress may not simply commandeer legislative processes of states by directly compelling them to enact and enforce a federal regulatory program. We have always understood that even where Congress has the authority in the Constitution to pass laws requiring or prohibiting certain acts, it lacks the power to compel the states to require or prohibit those acts. There's no such thing as an unfunded mandate. There might be an unfunded suggestion, and there might be funded suggestions, but the states are not under the authority of Congress. There's no such thing as an unfunded mandate. Do I need to say that again? So you're gonna hear it. You're gonna hear it over and over and again, okay? So what happens is, what I've seen in courtrooms is say, oh, that's preempted by Congress's act. That's a constitutional thing. The states have to abide by this because the federal government has said so. If anybody says that, they're literally violating the Constitution. They're actually at war. They're one of those domestic enemies. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Okay, uphold the Constitution. So that's an important thing. That's right out of the Supreme Court explaining that the Congress's separation of powers, this federal principle, is that Congress does not have authority over the states. Now, does that stimulate any questions like, well, how then do they? Yes?
Well, then how does the federal government tell all the states that they have to have this, like the Affordable Health Care Act, in a sense? How do they enforce on the states, you have to have this Medicare available for everyone?
Good question. Came up in the 11th Circuit. See, I read this stuff. It came up in the 11th Circuit in Pensacola, and Judge Vinson down there was listening to Florida say unfunded mandate. They're forcing us to do this. This is coercion. We'll have no choice, and it's going to affect. Now, they at least understood that. Florida understood in their argument that, hey, the reason why we're having this discussion is because we've tapped into the funding source. They at least understood that. And then Judge Vinson came back and said, Florida, quit your whining about coercion. No, the Congress has no authority to compel you to participate. You're whining to me about the provisions of a benefit system that you've opted into that you had no requirement to opt into. Goes back to the maxim that Blackstone said, that we're bound to obey those upon whom we depend. It's a maxim in law. So what happens is, if they opt into a program, then the rules of the program now supersede. But what they have to do is they actually have to have the legislature to opt into the program, actually has to write a law that implements the program. So it's happening right now, and the news agencies aren't covering it. Right now in Virginia, somebody's up there writing laws to accomplish the Affordable Health Care Act, Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. So
Even
somebody
though we're
wrote,
suing? We're
What's
in the
that?
process of, aren't we in the process of suing?
no, we sued.
We already sued.
We sued. And there was an Affordable Care Act provision in Virginia law that prohibited Virginia from implementing it. But the next legislature, next session, is now implementing it. Having to write legislation to implement it. You know what all they have to do to get out of it? Is not write legislation to implement it. And we're completely oblivious. Okay, there's people in the legislature going, hey, okay, danger. In fact, Bob Marshall, the delegate from Loudoun County, is saying, I've got 2 bills here. Do you see what's going on? They're gonna do it anyway. They're complaining about it, but they're doing it anyway. Hey, I've got 2 bills here that prohibit, since they're gonna do it and implement it, I've got a bill here that says that people in Virginia, religious institutions, won't have to do it. Because the federal government's not granting waivers to the religions they don't like. Okay, if you're not in a certain club, you're not getting a waiver, an exemption. So he's saying, hey, we're gonna make sure that Catholics in Virginia don't have to participate in the murder of the innocent unborn. That they don't, we're gonna tell Virginia that the police power of Virginia is prohibited from exercising the police power against these religious institutions who are in the system, who didn't have to join it, but for some reason, somehow, they got into the club and they're tied in with all these benefit systems or however it happened. Okay, don't know how it happened, but they're in these, like, their hospitals that get certain federal funds, some of their patients get federal funding. So now the federal funds are saying, hey, we're not gonna pay Medicare to you hospital unless you participate in this program that includes abortion. So that's what's going on. It's a matter of dependency. And how does it happen? The legislatures actually have to write a law and vote on it. And you have to have the news agencies not report it. So you really don't know what's going on, so you can't write a letter to your representative. Okay? So, unfunded mandate. Now I want to step back a bit. There was one, and I've got to close up. Some of you may have occurred to you that we talked about treaties. And I said that a treaty, if the Senate ratifies a treaty, then the courts in all the states have to abide by the treaty, notwithstanding what the state law or state constitution is. Okay? So that means, like, if the Senate ratifies it, the president signs a UN agreement on whatever. Senate doesn't ratify it, doesn't matter what the president signed. It doesn't affect the courts in the states. But if the Senate ratifies it, all of a sudden the states are stuck. It just bypassed the legislature. And that was a little provision they got in the Constitution. Be careful about treaties. Now the problem is, no officer in the states has to actually carry out the treaty. But if somebody sues somebody and says, hey, this treaty promises me, and it would have to be a foreigner, this treaty promises me this right, then the courts have to abide by it. So there's these weird little, sometimes it works here, and sometimes it doesn't in this other situation. So it is one of these things where that's an instance where no legislature would have to write a law. Some of those are self-executing. I mean, Congress doesn't even have to write a law. Some treaties just work. But the only time they'll work is if it comes up in a court case. Okay? If it never comes up in the court case, who cares what the treaty is? So that would be a time where it would trump state law. It usually has to do with property rights related to foreign entities. But in this case, there are no unfunded mandates. Okay? So when you hear people say it, New York versus United States, Prince and Mack versus United States, that the government, Congress may not compel the states to enact legislation or to implement any federal program. Any federal program. It's a fact. So what's happened if they're saying they're mandated by the federal government, it's because they signed up for it. Okay? All right, any questions? Your assignment, you're going to read about states. Read about the states. And what I'd like to do is, on next week, you're going to read about states. You're going to then next week turn in your assignment. What I'm going to do at the end of class next week, I'm going to go over objectives of a test. I'm going to give you a test. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the things that I want you to know. There are certain Bill of Rights items that when somebody asks you, what's the Second Amendment? You don't want to go, the amendment that's second? It won't do good on your political science test, okay, in college. So there's certain amendments that are very critical. I always forget, like the other day, I forgot the third. What's the third? Oh yeah, you can't keep the army in somebody's house, without permission kind of thing or something like that. So there's a couple of them that, I'm like, well, how often does that discussion come up? So it's just not on my list. So there's a few things there that I'm going to say. Make sure that you answer these questions correctly. Okay, so I'll give that to you next week. So when you're here, when you go home, we'll give you a study time, and then I'm going to send you a test. So it gives you an opportunity to prepare. And I'll figure out how you guys have accountability on that. Whether I got to be there, or we're going to have to sit down and do it together, or what. I don't know. I have to figure that out. But it's going to be closed book. A closed book
We
test.
send home tests all the time,
Do you?
and the mom's in charge of the
Okay.
building.
So it'd be closed book.
Yeah.
Okay? But I'll warn you ahead of time what those irreducible minimums are. Okay, I'm not just gonna spring on you. I'm gonna focus your study